The thirsty old man had just bought a bottle of alcohol from a vending machine when he suddenly noticed a man nearby clutching his head, collapsing to the ground, and writhing in agony. He was about to find someone to help when he realized that everyone else on the street was suffering from the exact same condition. Even more horrifying, a blonde woman stepped out of a car, poured gasoline all over herself, and set herself on fire right in front of him. At this point, the old man was no longer acting like a tough old man. He was scared absolutely senseless. Within moments, the entire street was littered with corpses. This was a virus even more terrifying than Ebola, with a 100% fatality rate. It could spread through the air, and once infected, victims would become uncontrollably driven to hurt themselves. Within just a few hours, an entire town could be turned into a graveyard. And the people who unknowingly triggered this disaster were a young couple who had been stargazing in the wilderness. Suddenly, a meteor-like object came crashing down from the sky and landed nearby. When they approached it, they discovered that it was actually the wreckage of a satellite. Thinking they had stumbled upon something valuable, the couple decided to take the satellite back to town. Little did they know that this single decision would bring total destruction upon the entire town. By the time the military arrived at the crash site, all they found was a huge crater left behind by the satellite. Fortunately, they were able to track its signal and determine that it had landed in the small town below. 2 soldiers immediately got in their vehicle and headed there. Meanwhile, the satellite wreckage had already been taken to the town's fire station by the young couple. The experienced fire chief assumed it was nothing more than an ordinary communications satellite, so they decided to open it up and examine what was inside. But just half an hour later, something terrifying happened. When the 2 soldiers finally followed the signal into town, the place had already become a dead city. Bodies were scattered all over the streets, and the entire area was filled with the stench of death. Every victim had died horribly, with the veins on their faces clearly visible. When the old man spotted the soldiers, he ran toward them as if they were his last chance to survive. But before he could even ask what had happened, the soldier behind the wheel suddenly grabbed his head and began convulsing in agony, dying right there against the steering wheel. Then, the second soldier suffered the same fate and collapsed dead the moment he opened the door. Soon afterward, military headquarters learned just how serious the situation had become. Based on the footage transmitted by the soldiers before their deaths, they initially determined that some kind of unknown virus had broken out in the town. For safety reasons, they immediately ordered the town to be isolated and sealed off, while also sending drones in to investigate the situation. At the same time, George, the head of the military's biological defense department, quickly assembled several virus experts to help him uncover the truth behind the incident. After briefly explaining why they had been called in, George played them a recording of the soldiers' deaths. The footage showed that the 2 soldiers had died horribly before they even had a chance to get out of the vehicle. This alone demonstrated just how terrifying the virus was. Not only could it spread through the air, but it also had virtually no incubation period. Once infected, death was inevitable. They named the virus the Andromeda strain. George then played the thermal imaging footage transmitted by the drone. But sharp-eyed biologist Angela immediately noticed something strange. One of the bodies beside the vehicle appeared to have been moved. After comparing thermal images taken at 2 different times, they confirmed that it had indeed been moved. Could there still be survivors somewhere inside the town? After putting on their protective suits, the experts decided to head to the site themselves to investigate and, hopefully, find the survivor who might still be alive. However, when they arrived above the town, they discovered countless crows feeding on the infected bodies. It seemed the virus didn't kill birds, but the birds could still become carriers of the virus. They absolutely couldn't be allowed to leave the town. The helicopter immediately sprayed pesticides into the air, killing every bird in the area. Next, 3 experts were dropped into the town and began investigating the virus. Before long, they discovered something strange. Every corpse had visible external injuries, yet not a single drop of blood had come out. The 3 of them continued driving in the jeep left behind by the soldiers. Using satellite coordinates, they eventually reached the fire station and found the satellite wreckage that had been taken there. The wreckage had already been opened, so the 2 men restored the outer casing and prepared to take it back for further research. Meanwhile, Angela stayed behind to examine the bodies. She cut open one of the corpse's arms, only to discover that the blood coming out had somehow turned into powder. No wonder none of the bodies had any blood. The virus had apparently changed the blood itself. As they continued searching for survivors, the 3 eventually arrived at a store, where they encountered a horrifying sight. A headless body was lying on the floor. When they checked the security footage, they saw exactly how the man had died. To their shock, he had walked into the supermarket carrying a chainsaw and then used it to cut off his own head. Apparently, the virus could also drive infected people to commit violent acts of self-harm. Bill believed they should simply use a nuclear weapon to destroy the entire town. That would save them the trouble and completely eliminate the source of the virus. The others agreed and were unwilling to risk their lives by continuing the investigation. Only Dr. Jeremy and Angela objected. After all, they still hadn't found the last survivor. If they could find him, they might be able to use him to develop an antibody. Besides, they couldn't be certain that a nuclear strike would actually eliminate the virus. While they were still arguing, Angela suddenly heard a baby crying. Following the sound, they discovered a several-month-old baby inside a car, while her mother had already turned into a cold corpse. The group decided to take the satellite and the baby and leave immediately. But just as they were about to board the helicopter, an old man suddenly rushed out and attacked Bill without warning. Fortunately, Jeremy stepped in and stopped him in time. And that old man was none other than the desperate old man from the beginning. Somehow, he had actually survived. Now that they had finally found the missing survivor, they immediately took him with them and evacuated the town, planning to bring him back to the laboratory for further examination. What they failed to notice, however, was an infected dog still wandering the streets. And that would eventually become a major hidden threat for the virus to spread beyond the town. Soon, everyone returned to the laboratory. Known as Wildfire, the facility specialized in handling the most dangerous biological and viral threats, and its security level was virtually off the charts. Before entering the laboratory, everyone had to undergo full-body disinfection, followed by oral antibiotics to prevent infection. They then had their identities verified through retinal scans. Finally, they had to remove all their clothes and undergo a completely thorough 360-degree decontamination. From the inside out, every possible precaution had been taken, leaving virtually no room for an accident. And even if a viral containment breach occurred, the facility had a way to stop the infection from spreading. The entire laboratory was located underground, with a small nuclear reactor at the very bottom. If an uncontrollable incident occurred, the security system would automatically activate the facility's self-destruct protocol. 15 minutes later, the entire facility would be reduced to rubble. Everyone immediately panicked after hearing this, but Jeremy told them not to worry. After all, Bill had been single for 30 years, which meant he was the one person who could shut down the self-destruct sequence. It was an emergency measure they had specifically prepared for situations like this. The reason they had chosen Bill was because the military had conducted extensive testing and discovered that, at critical moments, only a single man could make the most rational decision. However, they had no idea that George had already recommended to the president that they simply drop a nuclear bomb on the town. The president refused. He was about to run for another term and didn't want the incident to damage his chances in the election. So instead, he decided to give Dr. Jeremy some time and see whether he could come up with a better solution. Meanwhile, the team at the laboratory quickly began studying the satellite responsible for the disaster. They were certain that the virus had come from inside the satellite. Otherwise, the young couple could never have carried it all the way back to town while remaining alive. And judging from the satellite's appearance, it didn't look like an ordinary communications satellite at all. It seemed more like some kind of biological containment device, specifically designed to capture and preserve an unknown organism. George had deliberately kept this information from them. It seemed the military was hiding something. They then opened the satellite again and discovered a strange black substance inside. After analyzing it, they confirmed that it was indeed the Andromeda strain. Soon, the old man finally woke up in the hospital. Angela questioned him about what had happened, and from his story, she was able to piece together the events of the outbreak. But one question remained unanswered. Why hadn't he been infected? The old man himself was completely confused. He had been drinking heavily at the time and initially thought everything he was seeing was just a hallucination. But eventually, he realized that it had all actually happened. Angela suddenly had a bold idea. Could the alcohol have somehow protected him from the virus? But that theory was quickly ruled out because the several-month-old baby obviously hadn't been drinking. With no breakthrough in sight, they could only continue studying the Andromeda strain. This time, Charlene made an astonishing discovery. The Andromeda strain had no DNA and no proteins. It didn't even contain the most basic amino acids. There was no way something like this could have naturally originated on Earth. It was most likely from outer space. Only George knew the answer. After everyone demanded an explanation, he finally revealed the truth. The Andromeda strain really had come from outer space. The military had discovered a wormhole somewhere in the solar system, so they launched a satellite to observe it. Their goal was to collect biological samples that didn't originate on Earth and bring them back for research. But the satellite unexpectedly crashed into the small town. To prevent widespread panic, the military had deliberately kept the truth hidden. What nobody realized was that the virus had already begun spreading far beyond the town. The infected dog eventually died in the wilderness, and a nearby crow became the next carrier of the virus. Before long, an incident occurred at a bar dozens of kilometers away from the town. A police officer had just walked inside when he suddenly grabbed the bartender's hand, raised his pistol, and shot everyone in the bar. Just when the bartender thought she was about to be killed as well, the police officer suddenly turned the gun on himself. He had clearly been infected with the Andromeda strain, and it wasn't just the bar. Even a much more distant observation post experienced an outbreak. A huge eagle suddenly appeared in the sky and dropped an infected rat right in front of the soldiers. None of them realized the danger. They simply found the eagle's behavior amusing. But when one of the soldiers casually stepped forward and kicked the rat, he suddenly felt an unbearable pain in his head before collapsing dead on the spot. Before the others could figure out what was happening, they began experiencing the exact same symptoms. Connors started mumbling to himself, and the next second, he suddenly went berserk, grabbed his weapon, and unleashed a barrage of gunfire at his former comrades. In desperation, one of the soldiers had no choice but to shoot him dead. But before they could even recover, the remaining soldiers also began turning on each other, with some even pointing their weapons at themselves. Seeing this, one soldier quickly jumped into a jeep and drove away. But the moment he reached the military base, something was clearly wrong with him too. He showed no intention of slowing down and began driving wildly through the compound, heading straight toward a restricted area. After repeated warnings failed, the commanding officer had no choice but to order the soldiers to open fire. In the end, the infected soldier was riddled with bullets. The news quickly reached George. He immediately reported the situation to his superiors and once again requested permission from the president to launch a nuclear strike. To prevent the situation from getting even worse, the president hesitated for only a moment before approving the request. Soon, a fighter jet carrying a nuclear warhead took off. However, just as the pilot activated the arming system and prepared to launch the bomb, the laboratory made a brand new discovery. After analyzing the environment in which the Andromeda strain thrived, they discovered something shocking. The organism could actually absorb nuclear radiation. That meant a nuclear bomb wouldn't destroy it at all. Instead, the radiation would help the organism grow even stronger. Jeremy immediately called George and told him what they had discovered. He then explained the situation to the president through a video conference. Fortunately, just 1 second before the bomb was supposed to be launched, the pilot received an order from headquarters to abort the mission. The moment she disarmed the weapon and turned the jet around, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. But before they could celebrate for even 3 seconds, another disaster struck. The pilot suddenly realized that she had lost control of the aircraft. Something was rapidly corroding her helmet right before her eyes. Even though she had already disarmed the nuclear weapon, the arming system suddenly activated again and the bomb was released. Moments later, the fighter jet crashed and the nuclear warhead detonated. Unexpectedly, the situation had still developed in the worst possible direction. As the nuclear blast swept across the area, the virus began spreading uncontrollably. From the footage transmitted before the aircraft crashed, they could see that the pilot's helmet was rapidly dissolving. Certain microorganisms were capable of dissolving plastic helmets, so they suspected that the virus had mutated and that the burning corpse of the pilot had carried it into the atmosphere. Even more terrifyingly, large numbers of dead animals began appearing outside the immediate blast zone. This meant the virus was expanding its range of infection. The military had no choice but to repeat their previous strategy. They began spraying pesticides throughout the contaminated area, killing every bird and animal they could find in an attempt to prevent the virus from spreading any further. Back at the laboratory, Angela discovered that some people didn't die immediately after being infected. Instead, they initially became extremely violent. The police officer from the bar was a good example. He was diabetic, and because his body lacked insulin, he developed ketoacidosis. Perhaps this state of acidosis had delayed the Andromeda strain from fully taking effect. The old man and the baby had experienced something similar. For different reasons, both of them had developed acidosis, which was probably why they had managed to survive this long. This suggested that the Andromeda strain could only survive within a specific pH range. Unfortunately, that same pH range was deadly to humans, meaning they couldn't use acidosis as a practical way to fight the virus. Charlene then made another discovery. When the virus was suppressed by acidosis during the infection process, the Andromeda strain would instead attack the brain, causing cerebral hemorrhaging. This could explain why some infected people were driven to mutilate themselves. To find another way to kill the Andromeda strain, Jeremy began experimenting with various bacteriophages. Before long, the experiments produced a promising result. One particular bacteriophage was able to completely suppress the virus. But when Jeremy conducted another test, he was shocked to discover that the bacteriophage suddenly stopped working. He found this extremely strange because the samples came from a completely different strain of Andromeda. From this, Jeremy concluded that the Andromeda strain wasn't simply evolving continuously. It might actually possess a form of intelligence, allowing different strains to communicate with one another. Whenever the organism detected a threat, it could immediately evolve to counter it. But by this point, the experts were running out of time. The virus was being carried farther and farther by the wind, and it would soon reach Las Vegas. If it contaminated an international flight and was carried to other parts of the world, the consequences would be unimaginable. Their only option was to shut down all flights and evacuate everyone living along the virus's projected path. And at this critical moment, their research finally produced a breakthrough. They scanned the black substance recovered from the satellite once again and discovered that it contained not only the pathogen, but also two additional elements. After analyzing the molecular structures of these two elements, they discovered something astonishing hidden inside them, a sequence of binary code. Combined with their earlier discovery of the wormhole, Jeremy came up with a shocking theory. The virus might not have come from outer space at all. It could have come from humanity's own future. Someone must have been using the binary code to transmit a message. After decoding it, they found a string of numbers with a word written underneath. Translated, it read, Bacillus subtilis. This bacterium was extremely rare. There was only one place on Earth where it could be found, a hydrothermal vent 3 kilometers beneath the ocean. It could survive in an extremely harsh environment filled with strong acids and fed on the fluid-like overflow discharged from the vents. And the chemical composition of the Andromeda strain happened to be exactly the same as that fluid. In other words, Bacillus subtilis could consume the Andromeda strain as food. Perhaps humanity in the future had also been attacked by the Andromeda strain. But by then, Bacillus subtilis had already gone extinct. That's why they sent the message through the wormhole. Their goal was simply to warn present-day humanity to protect the bacteria at all costs. The group immediately reported their theory to the president. Although he also thought the whole thing sounded completely absurd, there was nothing else they could do except give it a try. He immediately ordered someone to send samples of the bacteria to the laboratory. It turned out that the US government had been harvesting this bacteria for years and had even been criticized by marine conservation organizations for doing so. But despite the backlash, they never stopped. Once the samples arrived, the laboratory immediately began working on an antidote. Meanwhile, the soldiers stationed inside the contaminated zone came under attack again. A huge flock of infected crows suddenly swooped down on them, killing the entire squad within seconds. Some of the bodies rolled into a nearby river, while many of the crows also fell into the water, contaminating the river and killing large numbers of aquatic creatures. It seemed the virus had evolved once again. It no longer needed animals as carriers to spread. It began traveling downstream through the water, while simultaneously continuing to spread across the land. Fortunately, after extensive experiments and testing, the Wildfire Laboratory successfully developed an antidote using Bacillus subtilis. Under George's command, the military immediately flew helicopters to the laboratory. Once the antidote had been loaded onto the aircraft, they began spraying it throughout the contaminated zone. The result was exactly what they had predicted. The moment the Andromeda strain came into contact with the antidote, it was instantly destroyed. However, just when everyone thought the crisis was finally over, a containment breach suddenly occurred inside the Wildfire Laboratory, automatically activating the self-destruct system. It turned out that Charlene had secretly hidden a vial of the virus and planned to smuggle it out. Unfortunately, something went wrong and the virus leaked. There was actually someone in the upper levels of the government who didn't want the Andromeda strain to disappear completely. After all, it was the most terrifying biological weapon on Earth. Whoever controlled it could potentially dominate the world. So they had secretly kidnapped Charlene's family and threatened her into stealing a vial of the virus from the laboratory. To make matters worse, a flashing light triggered Chow's seizure, which happened to damage the electronic panel used to cancel the self-destruct sequence. Now, the only way to stop the countdown was to reach another floor. Since the elevators were no longer usable, Bill and Jeremy had no choice but to climb through the central shaft. But Bill accidentally slipped and fell into the heavy water surrounding the nuclear reactor, dying on the spot. Since only Bill's fingerprint could deactivate the self-destruct system, Cho regained consciousness and immediately climbed down through the pipes. Ignoring the danger to himself, he jumped into the heavy water and cut off Bill's finger. He threw the finger to Jeremy, but the intense radiation caused him to lose consciousness as well. Fortunately, Jeremy lived up to everyone's expectations. He successfully reached the upper floor and deactivated the self-destruct system. Meanwhile, George and his team finally managed to eliminate every last trace of the virus.